Why do you believe what you believe? No, I'm asking seriously. Right now, in your head, there is some belief about people, about the world, about yourself, and it feels completely reasonable to you. You believe that you are a clear-thinking, rational person who isn't easily swayed. In reality, according to a 2015 Pew Research survey, 73% of Americans said they think more rationally than the average person. Now just pause for a second and think about that. If the majority believe they are above average, then clearly something is off. And the answer is not everyone is right. The problem is that the human brain, including yours and mine, is not designed to see the world objectively. It is designed to create a sense of certainty, to make us believe we are right, even when we are overlooking a ton of information we don't even realize we're overlooking. You feel like you're thinking logically, but most of the time, you are just rationalizing what your brain wants to believe. I'm not asking you to doubt everything. I'm just asking you to recognize one very simple but extremely hard to accept thing. The feeling of I'm thinking correctly is not evidence that you are actually thinking correctly. And it is precisely in that gap between feeling and reality that bias quietly grows. To understand why that gap exists, you have to start with a truth that most of us are uncomfortable hearing. The human brain did not evolve to find truth. It evolved only to help us survive. Nature does not reward accuracy. Nature only rewards staying alive. In a primitive environment, a slow but correct decision could turn your ancestors into dinner for a saber-toothed cat, while a fast but wrong decision could buy them a few seconds to escape. So over hundreds of thousands of years, the brain learned to prioritize speed over accuracy. It developed shortcuts, heuristics, to reduce information processing time. And the interesting or troubling thing, depending on how you look at it, is that those very heuristics are what we now call bias. They are not bugs. They are survival strategies. Did you know that even though the brain makes up only about 2% of body weight, it consumes up to 20% of your total energy? That makes it one of the most metabolically expensive organs. To save energy, it has to find every possible way to simplify the world around it, compress information, ignore details, predict instead of analyze. And every time it does that, some form of bias emerges. This aligns perfectly with a 2011 University of Oregon study in survival behavior simulations. Irrational but fast decisions increase survival rates more than slow but accurate ones. You don't need to be right. You just need to be fast. Now let's talk about one of the most powerful phenomena wired into your nervous system: negativity bias. Baumeister and colleagues showed that humans react to negative stimuli about 10 times more strongly than to positive stimuli. Think about it. A compliment might make you happy for 5 minutes, but a criticism can keep you awake all night. This was extremely useful in nature. Mistaking a shadow for a tiger is harmless. Mistaking a tiger for a shadow is fatal. Your ancestors survived, not because they assessed risk accurately, but because they over-assessed risk. And you inherited that entire system. So biases anchoring confirmation bias, loss aversion availability heuristic, are not accidents of cognition. They are evolutionary legacies. They are the brain's default mode. They help you react quickly, save energy, and sometimes avoid danger, but they come at the cost of seeing the world as it really is. You were not born to be objective. You were born to survive. And this is the point that should make us stop and think. If bias is the default design, if your brain is built from the ground up to be biased, then how can you, a 21st century individual with smartphones, satellites, and modern science, ever know when you are truly thinking versus when your brain is simply pushing you down a path that's been well worn for hundreds of thousands of years of evolution? Or to put it more bluntly, if bias is built in, How do you even recognize when it is controlling you? And if you want a clear example of the brain prioritizing speed over truth, there is no stronger evidence than the effect discovered by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in 1974, anchoring bias, the Neo effect. It is one of the simplest mechanisms in the brain, yet also one of the most dangerous, because it operates silently the moment you receive the first piece of information. Their classic experiment went like this. Participants were asked to spin a wheel of fortune numbered from 0 to 100. Importantly, the wheel was rigged to stop only at two values, 10 or 65. Then they were asked, what percentage of African countries are in the United Nations? The results stunned the psychology world. People who saw 10 gave answers 40–60% lower than those who saw 65. A single random, irrelevant, illogical number with no basis whatsoever strongly influenced their thinking simply because it appeared first. The first number became an anchor that pulled their entire train of thought toward it. And you think you're immune? You're not. Anchoring operates constantly in modern American life. When you walk into a car dealership and the first car is priced at $42,000, your brain immediately treats that number as the reference point, and every price after that is judged relative to that absurd anchor. You see a house listed at $780,000, and even if you have no intention of buying it, that number still anchors the way you evaluate other houses around $650,000. Even on the SAT, many American students take a practice test with a low score and get anchored to lower expectations of their own ability. The strange thing is that even when you know this is the anchoring effect, you are still controlled by it, because anchoring does not rely on logic. It relies on a very deep processing mechanism in the brain, one that prioritizes the first information, because the brain doesn't have enough energy to compute everything from scratch. Think back to the times you bought something online. The 50% off sticker price of $299 dropped to $149, even though you had no idea whether the item was ever really worth $299. The $299 anchor is what creates the feeling of what a deal, not the true value. Anchoring even sneaks into places you'd never expect science. Remember the Millikan story from earlier? The electron charge value he published, even though it was wrong, became the anchor that kept the entire physics community approaching it for decades instead of surpassing it. It wasn't that everyone wanted to believe him. They simply couldn't escape the psychological anchor created by the first result. In medicine, anchoring causes doctors to misdiagnose. The first symptom the patient describes becomes the initial hypothesis, and everything afterward, tests, protocols, medications, gets pulled toward that hypothesis. Many studies show doctors often cling to their initial diagnosis to a dangerous degree, even when later data contradicts it. In finance, financial experts, the people supposedly most cold-blooded in their thinking, continually fall victim to anchoring. A stock that once traded at $90 becomes the real value in investors' minds, causing them to hold it all the way down to $50, just because they hope it will return to the old level, even when there is no economic reason to expect that. Anchoring makes markets crazier, bubbles bigger, and people more confident in things that aren't true. The scariest thing about this bias is that you cannot turn it off. Your brain is programmed to take the first piece of information as the standard, because in evolution, the first signal might have been the sound of a predator. But in the modern world, that sound can be a meaningless number on a billboard, an inflated house price set by a realtor, or a mistaken measurement in a lab. So if you ever feel you are thinking objectively, remember one thing: every thought you have is being pulled by some anchor that you may not even remember where it came from. And if a random number can shift an entire group's thinking by 40–60%. Ask yourself how many other invisible anchors are distorting the most important decisions in your life without you ever noticing. And if anchoring shows that just one first number can bend an entire train of thought, there is an even more subtle, quieter, and perhaps more dangerous phenomenon. Your brain can make you believe you understand something, even when you understand nothing at all. Imagine this. After World War II, on the islands of Melanesia, local people witnessed a strange scene for years. American planes landing on makeshift runways, bringing canned food, medicine, radios, blankets, metal tools, things they had never seen before. Then the war ended. The Americans left. The planes disappeared. But the islanders reached a very logical conclusion from their perspective. If they recreated what they had seen, the planes would return. So they built wooden control towers, wore coconut shell headphones, lit long fires to mimic signal lights, and stood waving guiding flags. They did everything they had observed. Everything. Except the most important thing, real understanding of the logistics system, airplane engines, and the entire military apparatus behind it. And the planes, of course, never returned. What they created is called a cargo cult. But what's more frightening is this. Your brain operates in exactly the same way. You also build cargo cults in your own thinking, half-baked explanatory models that you believe are complete. This is not speculation. It was proven in a classic 2002 study by Rosenblit and Kale called The Illusion of Explanatory Depth. They asked participants to rate how well they understood how familiar objects work: zippers, toasters, cell phones, and most famously, the toilet. In step 1, 70% of participants confidently said they understood fairly well or very well how these things functioned. But when asked to explain in detail, their confidence plummeted, not a little dramatically, almost to the bottom of the scale. Someone who had claimed, "I understand how a toilet works," suddenly couldn't describe the siphon mechanism, flush valve, or water pressure. It turns out most of us do not understand the things we think we understand. We only understand the feeling that we understand. And the brain is very good at creating that feeling. Why? Because truly understanding something requires energy, a lot of energy. Analyzing, modeling, tracing causal relationships demands complex neural processing. But as you already know from earlier, the brain is only 2% of body weight, but uses 20% of total energy. It is extremely stingy with processing power. So instead of deep learning, the brain prefers a fast solution. Find a rough, easy-to-grasp model with a few vivid details. Then declare, "I get it." In other words, the brain prefers the feeling of understanding over actual understanding. And right there, a very powerful form of bias takes shape. If you feel you understand, you stop learning. You stop asking questions. You stop looking for disconfirming evidence. You defend that half-baked model as truth because the brain has stamped it process. This is why you encounter arguments where people speak with absolute confidence about tax policy, climate change, epidemiology, or macroeconomics, fields where even experts spend decades understanding only a small part. It's not that they're stubborn. It's that their brains have created the feeling of "I understand the issue" with just a few disconnected pieces of information. The Melanesian cargo cult and the cargo cult in your thinking differ in materials. One is wood and fire. The other is memory and intuition. But they are identical in essence. Both only copy the surface of reality. You think you understand economics when you see gas prices rise. You think you understand education when you hear one personal story. You think you understand politics when you watch a 2-minute video. You think you understand another person when you see an expression on their face. But all of it is surface, disconnected observations that the brain turns into a seemingly reasonable story. And just like in a cargo cult, those stories do not lead you to truth. They only lead you to comfort. This is why the illusion of explanatory depth is considered one of the most foundational biases. It makes you think you have knowledge, when all you have is the illusion of knowledge. And the illusion of knowledge is more dangerous than lack of knowledge. Lack of knowledge drives you to learn. The illusion of knowledge stops you from learning. It slams the door on inquiry shut. Connect this to our topic. When you believe you understand, bias becomes strongest. Confirmation bias, anchoring, motivated reasoning, all become loyal mercenaries, defending your wrong but confident model. And that is one of the reasons unbiased thinking is nearly impossible. You are not just fighting bias, you are fighting the illusion that you don't have bias. Like the Melanesians standing on a wooden runway, looking at the sky and wondering why the planes don't return, you too stand among the mental models you've built, believing they are complete and wondering why the real world doesn't behave the way you think it should. If the illusion of I get it can make you confident in half-baked explanatory models, there is one famous story in the history of physics that shows even the most brilliant minds, people who spent their entire lives pursuing truth, can still fall into the subtle trap of bias. I'm talking about Robert A. Millikan's 1909 experiment measuring the charge of the electron, perhaps one of the most frequently cited experiments in every modern physics textbook. Millikan's idea was extremely elegant. He used micrometer-sized oil droplets, let them fall between two metal plates, then adjusted the electric field until the droplet hovered motionless. From that balance of forces, he calculated the electron charge, a fundamental constant of nature. But there was a problem. Millikan used a value for the viscosity of air based on experiments from the late 1890s that later turned out to be inaccurate. It wasn't his fault. Better data simply didn't exist at the time. Still, in 1910, Millikan published the electron charge as 1.592 cosine 10⁻⁴ coulomb, lower than today's accepted value, 1.602176634 cosine 10⁻⁴, C, fixed in the SI system since 2019. The error was not huge, only about 0.6%, but in precision physics, 0.6% is a world of difference. And now comes the scary part. After Millikan published his result, and especially after he won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1923, the scientific community became almost anchored to his value. For about 20 years, from 1910 to the late 1930s, repeated experiments produced results, slowly creeping upward, bit by bit, each year inching closer to the correct value. But not a single result jumped clearly beyond Millikan's value, even though measurement techniques at the time had advanced enough to produce more accurate results from the start. When you look at the aggregated scientific publications from that period, from labs at Harvard University, the University of Chicago, to independent groups in Europe, you see a strange graph. The reported electron charge value rises slightly each year, as if the entire scientific community was tiptoeing toward the truth instead of leaping to it. This was not coincidence. This was anchoring bias at a community scale. Scientists, the very people who should be the model of objectivity, unconsciously adjusted their results so as not to go too far from Millikan's value. If a batch of results came in significantly higher, they would recheck equipment, rerun experiments, discard suspect data. And guess what? Those suspect data were often the correct ones. But anchoring did not work alone. It was reinforced by prestige bias, the tendency to give more weight to conclusions from highly prestigious figures. At the time, Millikan was one of the most influential people in the American physics community, a legendary professor at the California Institute of Technology, who literally helped build the institution. When someone of that stature publishes a value, the entire field feels it shouldn't contradict him. And finally, there was publication bias. Results that were unreasonable, especially those far above Millikan's value, were often not published or even submitted to journals because researchers believed they must have made a mistake. We know this because Millikan's own lab notebooks, analyzed late in the 20th century, contain many marginal notes. Oil droplets with discrepant results were marked "do not use," "error," or "not suitable." No one knows for sure whether Millikan discarded them unconsciously or deliberately. But we do know one thing. Even geniuses are not immune to bias. Perfect data does not exist. Only data that the human brain allows to be seen as reasonable exists. And that data is often bent to fit the initial belief so strongly that it can derail an entire field of science for 2 decades. This is the terrifying lesson. If a legendary scientist, a Nobel laureate, famous for his meticulousness and measurement precision, like Millikan, can still be led by bias, then who is safe? Or, as I sometimes joke, and you think you're different. No one is immune. Not me, not you, not professors, not market analysts, not doctors, not even the most prestigious research groups. And if bias can push an entire scientific community off course for 20 years, just imagine how many conclusions you are certain of today about yourself, about others, about the world, are also being quietly pulled off track by an invisible anchor you have never noticed. And if the Millikan story shows how a single number could accidentally anchor an entire scientific community for 2 decades, there is an even stronger, more widespread bias that sneaks into nearly every thought you've ever had. Confirmation bias, the tendency to confirm. If anchoring pulls you toward the first number, confirmation bias bends the entire world to fit what you already believe. One of the most classic demonstrations comes from a 1979 experiment by Stanford University psychologists. They recruited 2 groups of Americans with opposing views on the death penalty. One group believed it deters crime. The other believed it had no effect. Both groups were given the exact same set of data. 2 studies, one showing the death penalty reduced crime, the other showing it had no effect. The data was identical. The numbers were identical. The methods were identical. But the interpretations were completely opposite. The pro-death penalty group rated the study supporting their view as strong, scientific, convincing, while they called the other study flawed, unreliable. They must have messed up somewhere. And the anti-death penalty group did exactly the same thing. Only they swapped which study got which label. Both groups believed they were thinking rationally. Both believed they were following the evidence. And both were wrong. This is not laziness. This is motivated reasoning, a sophisticated mechanism where the brain selects evidence not to find truth, but to protect your existing belief. When information supports what you already believe, the brain releases dopamine, making you feel good. When information threatens your belief, the brain activates pain and threat processing regions. The brain is not neutral. It is a creature with interests, and its interest is to help you maintain the story you tell about the world. Confirmation bias is therefore not just a bad thinking habit. It is a biological structure. When you believe something, you don't just have a single belief. You have an entire network of memories, emotions, identity, and personal experiences tied to it. Challenging the belief is equivalent to challenging yourself, and the brain hates that feeling. That is why in modern American life, confirmation bias appears everywhere. not just in Stanford's lab. Look at politics. One person watches a speech and sees logic, persuasion, humanity. Another person, watching the exact same speech, sees stupidity, lies, danger. Not because the video is different, but because the information passes through two different mental filters. The same happens with vaccines. Two people read the exact same scientific paper, but one sees it as proof. It's safe, while the other sees it as not enough research. With climate change, over 99% of scientists agree temperatures are rising due to human activity. Yet confirmation bias drives many people to seek out that exact 1% of contrary articles to protect their pre-existing belief. On social media, this reaches supercharged levels: fandom, fans of a sports team, an artist, an influencer, a political party. They don't just select favorable information. They attack contradictory data as if it were a personal threat. The scary part is that you can see this very clearly in other people, but almost never in yourself. When you feel confident that you are analyzing objectively, there is a high chance you are simply filtering information more skillfully to reinforce your initial belief. The smarter the person, the better they are at fooling themselves, because they can construct better arguments. Smarter people, more data to choose from, better at defending wrong positions. Confirmation bias does not make you stupid. It turns you into a lawyer for your own beliefs. Think carefully. When you read a news story, what do you notice first? You notice the part that supports what you already believe. When you argue, you respond to the points you want to respond to, not the points the other side actually made. When you do more research, you are not researching. You are hunting for evidence to reinforce what you believed beforehand. And the brain is extremely good at hiding this behind a feeling of logic. You feel objective, even though you have been selectively processing data from the very first moment. Confirmation bias is one of the main reasons society is polarized. Science is misunderstood, and different groups seem to live in entirely different information universes. But the most dangerous thing is not politics or vaccines or climate. The most dangerous thing is this: it makes you believe that you yourself are not subject to confirmation bias. And if confirmation bias shows how the brain will bend data to protect belief, the next story reveals something even more troubling. Sometimes people know the correct method, know how to find truth, but still choose to do it wrong, not because they are bad, but because they are lazy. This is one of the most underrated experiments in the history of behavioral science. W. H. Young's 1937 rat maze experiment. Though rarely mentioned, this study exposes something crucial about how much the brain loves shortcuts, and how the scientific community can ignore truth simply because it requires too much effort. Young wanted to answer a seemingly simple question: how do rats learn? To do this, he designed a long corridor with multiple doors on each side. The rat would run from one end to the other, where food waited. Young wanted to teach them, always choose the third door from the starting position. It sounds easy to teach, but Young quickly realized that rats were not learning the way humans thought they learned. They were not counting. They were not using distance. They were not even relying on vision to identify the third door. They were cheating in their own rat way. When Young changed the color of the doors, the rats still found the third door. When he changed the room lighting, they still found it. When he changed the odor on the doors, they still found it. When he rotated the orientation of the panels, they still found it. It was as if they possessed a secret sense no one understood. Young began to suspect perhaps the rats were using sound, tiny vibrations from the floor as they ran. He tested it, and sure enough, the rats were relying on subtle cues humans didn't notice. This led Young to a realization. Unless he eliminated every possible confounding signal, he could never know whether they were truly learning or just using natural shortcuts. So Young did something no one at the time had done. He eliminated every variable. He replaced the wooden floor with sand to dampen sound. He sealed the corridor so the rats couldn't see outside light. He used chemicals to eliminate all odors. He made every door identical in color, material, and sound. Result, for the first time, the rats were forced to learn the actual task Young assigned. They could no longer cheat with extraneous cues. They genuinely learned the rule. Young's experiment, if you look closely, is one of the purest examples ever created of the scientific method. Identify every possible influencing variable, control them all, and test the hypothesis cleanly. But the shocking part is, for decades afterward, almost no one followed Young's method. There was no revolution in animal learning research. Young's approach was not widely adopted. No textbooks, courses, or research programs were built around what he discovered. Science essentially ignored him for many decades. Why? The brutally honest answer, because it was too much work. Conducting research like Young required enormous effort, long periods of time, and excruciating attention to detail. Most researchers did not want or could not invest that much energy in controlling variables. They wanted fast results, simple methods, easy publication, and so status quo bias, the preference for the familiar one. Instead of adopting Young's rigorous standard, they continued using simple, easy-to-run experiments, even though those produced noisy, biased, and sometimes meaningless results. Young had given science a map so clear it might as well have been written in red ink. This is the only way to know whether the animal has truly learned. And the scientific community replied, "Nice, but that's way too hard." This leads to a major lesson about bias that few people recognize. Laziness bias, a form of bias that makes us choose the easy, familiar, low-energy path, even when we know it is less accurate. The brain hates effort. Institutions, organizations, even the scientific community hate effort. And laziness bias is not confined to the lab. It exists in every aspect of your life. You choose simple explanations over correct ones. You choose familiar reasoning over rethinking from scratch. You choose existing understandings over confronting complexity. Looking at Young's experiment is looking at yourself. You too teach your brain using extraneous cues, old beliefs, first impressions, familiar emotions, pre-existing prejudices. You too decide based on shortcuts instead of deep investigation. You too ignore difficult methods, even though they would lead you to truth. And if laziness bias shows how we avoid intellectual effort, there is another bias that explains why we misjudge the world so badly. It is almost astonishing. Availability heuristic, the availability bias. This is the mechanism that makes your brain assume what is easy to recall must be true, and it is powerful enough to shape how you evaluate risk, danger, and even your own future. Start with one extremely famous example from Centers for Disease Control and Prevention data. Each year in the United States, on average, only 1 to 2 people die from shark attacks. In the same time period, over 5,000 people die from choking on food. That means you are about 2,500 times more likely to die from choking on a piece of chicken than from a shark. But if I asked you, what are you more afraid of? Almost certainly you would say sharks. Why? Because the brain does not count probabilities. It counts memories, vivid images, terrifying stories, funny or scary movie scenes you've seen. Sharks, thanks to movies, media, sensational news, have become an emotional symbol, while choking on food is just a boring, unmemorable event. And because sharks appear in your memory as vivid images, the brain assigns them a danger level, thousands of times higher than reality. Now look at an even more frightening example. And this one is about decisions that actually killed people. After the 9/11 attacks in 2001, millions of Americans became afraid of flying. They switched to driving for long trips. But research by psychologist Gerd Gigerenzer in 2004 showed that in the 12 months following 9/11s, approximately 1,600 additional people died in traffic accidents compared to the long-term average, meaning fear of flying, even though flying remained dozens of times safer than driving, killed more people than the attack itself, all because the brain does not distinguish between probability of occurring and what I easily remember. The image of planes crashing into towers evokes far stronger emotion than a sea of statistics about road safety. And as you see, emotion beats data almost every time. The availability heuristic works like this. If an event comes to mind easily, quickly, vividly, your brain rates it as more common, more important, and more dangerous than it really is. Conversely, if something is dull and unimpressive, even if its probability is hundreds of times higher, the brain treats it as negligible. This is why we fear terrorism more than heart disease, even though heart disease kills over 600,000 Americans every year. This is why we fear plane crashes, even though the odds of dying are 1 in millions, yet feel comfortable behind the wheel, where the odds of dying are thousands of times higher. This is why we remember other people's mistakes far more strongly than the good things they do. And it is also why you remember a nasty comment online 10 times longer than a sincere compliment. Humans did not evolve to calculate probabilities like a statistical computer. Humans evolved to survive by prioritizing what makes a strong impression, because in the ancestral environment, strong impressions usually meant danger. A noise in the bushes could be wind or a saber-toothed cat, and your ancestors who survived were the ones who reacted to every noise as if it were a saber-toothed cat. The availability heuristic was once a survival advantage, but in modern society, it has become the source of countless disastrous misunderstandings, and nowhere is this clearer than in media. A plane crash appears on national television. A rare shark attack becomes breaking news across every website. A controversial outlier study gets shared millions of times on Facebook. Meanwhile, the real leading killers, high blood pressure, smoking, obesity, car accidents, rarely make the evening news. Your brain, exposed to that distorted information diet, begins forming a warped risk map. Rare but dramatic things become major threats, while common but boring things become no big deal. This is why millions of Americans fear vaccines more than disease, even though CDC statistics show vaccines reduce mortality risk by dozens of times. This is why we fear rare scandals more than distracted driving, which kills over 3,500 people a year. This is why fake news spreads faster than truth. Fake news exploits emotion. Truth relies on attention, and we don't pay attention for long. The availability heuristic is a fear generator, a generator of false confidence, a generator of panic, and sometimes a generator of catastrophic decision. But the most dangerous thing is it makes you believe you are seeing the world as it really is, when in fact you are only seeing the world through whatever your brain remembers most easily. And if the availability heuristic shows how the brain prioritizes strong impressions over truth, the next story reveals something even more subtle. Sometimes your brain doesn't need data, doesn't need evidence, doesn't even need words. It only needs one tiny unconscious signal to create what you are convinced is the truth. This is the lesson from the most famous horse in the history of behavioral science, Clever Hans. In 1907, Hans's owner, Wilhelm von Osten, believed he had taught his horse to do arithmetic. In front of crowds, he would ask, "What is 2 plus 3? Hans tapped his hoof 5 times. "What is 9 minus 4? Hans tapped 5 times. The German press exploded. They called Hans the calculating horse, a scientific wonder, and thousands came to watch. The astonishing thing was that Hans answered correctly, even when strangers asked the questions, not just his owner. You can imagine the excitement at the time. And then the German government ordered an investigation. A commission of educators, scientists, and psychologists was formed. All of them concluded there was no trickery. Hans really was producing correct answers. People were almost ready to believe they were witnessing extraordinary animal intelligence. No one could solve the mystery until a young researcher named Oskar Punsk came along. Punsk was not satisfied with easy explanations. He did what good scientists always do: asked hard questions. He changed the environment, changed who asked the questions, changed the angle, changed the distance, and then he discovered what no one until then had noticed. Hans only answered correctly when the questioner knew the answer. When the questioner did not know the answer, Hans got it wrong. When the questioner stood behind a screen, Hans got it wrong. When the questioner looked away, Hans got it wrong. So what was happening? Punsk noticed that when Hans was approaching the correct number of taps, the questioner, despite trying to stay calm, would unconsciously lean slightly forward or shift posture in a tiny way. Hans saw that signal and stopped. When Hans tapped too many times, the questioner would slightly tense their face or lean slightly back. Hans saw it and adjusted. This was a historic moment. Hans did not know math. Hans was simply reading extremely subtle changes in the human body, micro signals that the questioner himself did not even know he was producing. Punsk called this phenomenon unconscious cueing, and it did not die with Hans. It is controlling you every day. You do this when you guess someone's emotions from their eyes or facial expression, and often get it wrong. You do this when you see someone go silent and assume they are angry just because their body sent a vague signal. You do this when you read a text message reply and your brain invents a tone the other person never used. You do this when you interpret someone's behavior based on a micro change in their facial expression, breathing, speech speed, or even an accidental pause. Clever Hans is not just a story about a horse. It is a story about all of us. Your brain does not merely process information. It creates information. It does not just register signals. It interprets signals. And worse, it mixes real signals with imagined ones, then gives you the certainty that you are reading it right. In personal relationships, this creates misunderstanding. In politics, it creates prejudice. In workplaces, it creates conflict. In science, it creates data bias that the data collector doesn't even know they are causing. How many times have you misinterpreted a facial expression? How many times have you believed someone meant something, only to later discover they were simply tired? How many times have you misjudged someone just because they slightly avoided your gaze? All these mistakes are not thinking errors. They are instincts. The human brain is born with the ability to read social signals, but that ability is not perfect. It was designed to be fast, not accurate. Clever Hans is a sharp reminder that you are reading phantom signals all the time, and your brain is filling in the blanks with stories it makes up, then forcing you to believe they are true. If one horse could convince an entire country of Germany that it knew math simply by responding to unconscious cues, ask yourself, in your own life, how many clever Hans situations exist? Situations where you think you understand another person, but in reality, you are only reacting to signals that even they don't know they are sending. If the clever Hans story shows how easily the brain can create truth from mere unconscious signals, there is an even more powerful, more deeply rooted, and far more dangerous bias, because it doesn't just shape the way you see the world, it shapes who you think you are. That bias is called identity protective cognition. It doesn't just make you selectively process information. It makes you defend beliefs the same way you defend your own identity. One of the strongest studies on this phenomenon was conducted in 2012 by Yale University, Professor Dan Kahan. Kahan wanted to answer what seems like a paradoxical question. Why don't people with greater scientific literacy necessarily become more objective and sometimes even become more polarized? His research analyzed thousands of Americans across different political groups, measuring their level of scientific understanding through basic tests on probability, logic, and topics such as climate change and nuclear technology. The shocking result: those with the highest scientific knowledge were actually the most politically polarized group. In other words, if they already believed something beforehand, knowledge didn't make them reconcile. Knowledge made them better at defending their belief. Supporters of position A used knowledge to prove A was correct. Opponents of A used the exact same kind of knowledge to prove A was wrong. Both sides increased their argumentative IQ, but decreased their ability to change their views. Kahan explained, this is not an intelligence problem. It is an identity problem. When a belief becomes part of who you are, part of the group you belong to, the community you live in, the family you were raised in, any information contradicting that belief is not processed as data. It is processed as a threat. In the brain, the regions that process social threat and the regions that process belief violation light up at the same time. In other words, when someone presents evidence you don't like, your brain reacts the same way it would if you were personally attacked. Not because you are stubborn, but because your brain treats changing your mind as losing your identity. This explains so many everyday phenomena you see around you, but never truly understand. Look at family arguments. When you present evidence about politics, economics, vaccines, the environment, your relatives do not respond like scientists. They respond like members of a social group under threat. They defend their belief not because it is correct, but because it is part of us. That is why they hear half the story and get angry before you even finish. It's not that they don't understand, it's that their brain thinks you are trying to change who they are. In the workplace, this bias explains why meetings that are supposedly just about data turn into emotional battlegrounds. A new proposal is not evaluated on its rationality. It is evaluated on which tribe it came from. Employees defend ideas not to improve the company, but to protect their role or position in the power structure. And in online communities, where identity is built with a few lines of bio and public posts, identity protective cognition becomes a superweapon. People don't argue to learn. They argue to prove their loyalty to their tribe, party, fandom, hobby, ideology. They don't read posts to understand. They read to find ammunition for their side. This is why two people with the exact same data can draw violently opposing conclusions. Same input data, different identity process it, completely opposite conclusions. When identity becomes tied to belief, the brain turns into a justification machine. It seeks out supportive evidence, ignores contradictory evidence, and if necessary, bends logic to preserve the story of who I am. In other words, you are not defending your opinion. You are defending the self-image that opinion creates. This also explains why intelligent people often argue more fiercely than average people. They don't just have more knowledge, they have more logical ammunition to defend their identity. And this is where I often repeat a sentence many people don't like to hear. The smarter the person, the better they are at fooling themselves, because they can construct better arguments. When you use your intelligence to seek truth, it is a wonderful tool. But when you use your intelligence to protect an illusion about yourself, it becomes a prison. Identity protective cognition gives you a feeling of certainty, a feeling of being right, a feeling of belonging. But it steals your ability to change. And without the ability to change, there is no learning. So the question now is no longer, what do you believe, but who are you if that belief changes? Because only when you separate your identity from your beliefs do you have any hope of thinking without bias, even if that is almost impossible. When identity protective cognition shows how the brain defends beliefs as if defending your very identity, there is another bias that quietly controls the way you see the world every day, to the point that you don't even realize it is operating. That bias is called the frequency illusion, more intriguingly known as the Bader-Meinhof effect. The term emerged in 1994 when linguist and journalist Arnold Zicke described the strange phenomenon. Once you notice something, you start seeing it everywhere, as if the world suddenly changed just to remind you of it. But the world didn't change. Your brain did. Zicke explained that the frequency illusion is actually a combination of two biases, selective attention and confirmation bias. First is selective attention. When your brain decides that some piece of information is important, it starts prioritizing it amid the flood of data you receive every day. This once helped your ancestors survive. When you heard a rustle in the bushes, you needed to pay more attention to it than to wind or birds. But in the modern world, this mechanism turns the brain into a highlight machine that flags everything it has recently learned. The second bias is confirmation bias. Once you believe something is appearing more often, your brain remembers every instance. It does appear to reinforce that belief, while ignoring all the times it doesn't. When these two biases work together, you get the frequency illusion. Whatever appears frequently in your mind starts to look like it's appearing frequently in reality. Take a very familiar example for Americans. Suppose you just bought a new pickup truck, say a Ford F-150, a vehicle you think you chose for its style, price, and utility. The very next day, you start noticing F-150s everywhere, in the supermarket parking lot, on the highway, in residential neighborhoods. Even your neighbor, whom you never paid attention to before, is driving the exact same model. You quietly think, is the whole country buying F-150s the same week I did? No, of course not. Those trucks were always there. But yesterday, your brain treated the F-150 as unimportant information and filtered it out of awareness. Today, because you just bought one, your brain flags it with a red marker, and suddenly you see it everywhere. The frequency illusion operates in every area of life, not just cars. You learn a new English word, and within that week, you see it 3 times. You hear someone mention a rare disease, and suddenly it feels like everyone is talking about it. You research a city, and then see it appear in a movie, an ad, a casual conversation, and your brain draws the wrong conclusion. Something special is happening. Nothing special is happening. You are just paying more attention. The frequency illusion has one extremely important consequence. It causes you to confuse frequent in perception with frequent in reality. This has many dangerous implications. In healthcare, a rare disease can appear to be spreading just because you read one article about it. In investing, you may think everyone is buying the same stock just because you saw a few identical comments online. In politics, you may feel an extreme viewpoint is rapidly gaining ground, when in reality, you just scrolled past 3 similar posts because the algorithm prioritized showing them. In personal life, you may think everyone is doing this. Everyone owns that. Everyone is talking about this topic, when in reality, only your brain is exaggerating their frequency. Remember this, the brain is not good at measuring frequency. It doesn't count. It only flags things that catch attention. And whatever is flagged is perceived as common. Zwicky once said something very insightful. What you pay attention to is what you think appears a lot. Unfortunately, your brain cannot distinguish between real attention and attention caused by bias. And so the frequency illusion is one of the biases that causes you to misjudge the world in a subtle but persistent way. It is not loud like confirmation bias, not obvious like anchoring, but it shapes the feeling that everything is happening around me, one of the most powerful feelings that drives human behavior. If the frequency illusion shows how the brain confuses, I see it often with it is actually common. There is another bias that causes you to misunderstand people more than any other mistake in life: the fundamental attribution error. This is one of the most important discoveries in social psychology, first described by researcher Lee Ross in 1977. And it shows that humans systematically misjudge others' behavior. Ross found that when observing someone's behavior, people tend to attribute it to the person's character or internal traits in 75% of cases, while the real cause often comes from situational factors that we don't see. In other words, when someone behaves badly, you think they are rude, disrespectful, impolite, when in reality they may be stressed, dealing with family issues, sick, or simply in a hurry. When someone seems cold, you think they are distant, unfriendly, when they may just be anxious or tired. Your brain doesn't like complex thinking. It likes simple stories it can tell quickly. That guy is just like that. She has that kind of personality. They're always like this. A daily example almost everyone in America has experienced. You send an email to a colleague and they reply with a curt received. No emoji, no thank you, no exclamation point. Your brain instantly creates an inference. They must be upset with me. What did I do wrong? They don't respect me. All from a two-word email. But you don't know that person was in a rush meeting, or driving, or replying from their phone, or just got called into the boss's office. But your brain doesn't wait for complete data. It doesn't want to investigate the real situation. It wants a story immediately. And the fastest story, not the most accurate story, usually wins. The fundamental attribution error appears everywhere in American society. On the highway, the driver in front slams on the brakes, and you instantly think idiot, instead of maybe they were avoiding a pothole, or they just saw a red light. In the classroom, a silent student is seen as uninterested, instead of under pressure, speaking a second language. In the workplace, an employee who submits a report late is labeled lazy, even though they may be overloaded with projects. In political debates, people don't criticize arguments. They criticize the person making the argument, assigning them fixed traits like naive, ignorant, extreme. And on the internet, where tone, facial expressions, and context are missing, the fundamental attribution error explodes most intensely. Any sentence can be interpreted in the worst possible tone. Someone asking, "Are you sure?" may just want confirmation, but you interpret it as doubt. Someone giving a short reply may just be busy, but you interpret it as disrespect. Someone not replying to a message may just have forgotten, but you interpret it as deliberately avoiding you. Why does the brain choose the simple script over the full truth? Because the simple script costs less energy to think. He did that because of situation ABC requires data, context, the ability to hypothesize, imagination. But to think he's just a rude person, you only need 1 second. The brain is an energy optimizing machine, and the attribution error is the perfect shortcut. It is also how the brain gives you a sense of certainty in a complex world. A behavior has countless possible causes. The brain picks the easiest one. It's who they are. But the problem is, When you apply the attribution error to others, you rarely apply it to yourself. If you reply with a short email, you tell yourself, I was busy. If you come across as rude, you think, I was stressed today. But when someone else does it, you say, that's just the kind of person they are. The brain has two judgment systems, one for you, one for others, and the system for others is always harsher. This leads to countless misunderstandings, conflicts, and hurts in daily communication. We judge character when we should judge circumstances. We draw conclusions about people when we should ask questions about situations. And sometimes, just one extra piece of contextual information can completely change the entire story. But the fundamental attribution error prevents you from seeing that. It closes the door to empathy. It makes you believe you are correctly reading other people, when in reality you are only reading your own bias. Ross said that the fundamental attribution error is one of the most universal mistakes humans make. I would add that it is also one of the most painful mistakes, because it causes you to misunderstand the people you care about, misjudge the people you work with, and argue pointlessly with people you have never truly understood. So if you've ever wondered why humans so often misunderstand each other, the simple answer is your brain prefers the easy story over the true story. According to a 2020 Pew Research Center survey, 80% of Americans believe that people from the other party are living in a completely different information universe. That number isn't just high, it's a warning. It says that Americans don't merely disagree on opinions. They are seeing different versions of reality. And this isn't solely the fault of social media, or the media, or political parties. The core of the problem lies in a much deeper psychological mechanism: selective exposure, the selective information bias. Decades of research, from the classic work of Sears and Friedman to modern analyses of internet user behavior, all show one thing: people actively seek out information that supports their existing beliefs and actively avoid information that challenges them, not because they lack intelligence, but because the brain views contradictory information as a threat to its own correctness. And as you already know from the previous section, when belief is tied to identity, contradictory information is no longer just data. It becomes a personal attack. Imagine two Americans, A and B, reading the news at the same moment. All the facts are identical. The economic situation is the same. Unemployment numbers are the same. Scientific reports are the same. But because of selective exposure, A consumes news from sources that reinforce his views. B does the same with his own sources. Result? Within 24 hours, they are no longer living in the same reality. They are living in two completely different cognitive maps. A 2018 study of more than 10 million article views showed that American users tend to intensify political selective exposure when they feel confused or out of control, meaning when the world feels more complex, people retreat into cognitive safe zones, reading only what helps them feel stable. This is nothing new. It is even instinctual. But in the age of algorithms, selective exposure has been amplified to an unprecedented degree. Social media platforms, Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, are optimized to keep you on the screen as long as possible. And data shows you stay longer when the content aligns with your beliefs. Result: the system continuously pushes content you agree with, gradually eliminates content you dislike, and within a few weeks, you find yourself in an environment where everything you see confirms your pre-existing thoughts. This is confirmation bias, automated by technology. The dangerous part is you don't realize it's happening. You feel the world really is as you see it, when in fact you are looking at a personalized version of reality. And from there, political bias becomes a self-reinforcing spiral. You believe something, you consume content that reinforces it. The algorithm feeds you more of the same. You believe it even more strongly. You have even less exposure to opposing content. Your belief becomes absolutely certain. A mild example: Surveys show that Americans typically rate their political opponents as more extreme than they actually are by 20–30%, simply because they are exposed to too much extreme content within their own information bubble. Another example, many people believe the other side's views represent the majority in society, even though most Americans actually hold more moderate views than either party assumes. And this is the most important point. Facts do not defeat political bias, because facts are not evaluated by the brain as simple data. The brain evaluates information based on a different question. Does this information threaten my identity? If the answer is yes, the brain activates defense mode, refute the data, question the source, attack the messenger, find flaws in the reasoning, or simply ignore it, completely unconsciously. The important thing I want to make clear, there is no right side or wrong side here. I am not describing one specific political camp. I am describing a mechanism of the human brain that applies to everyone, in every camp, in every era. Political bias is not because you are unintelligent or stubborn. It is the way the brain protects social cohesion, a mechanism that once helped your ancestors survive in primitive tribes. But in modern society, that mechanism leads to division. When each person believes their own facts are objective and the other side's facts are propaganda, dialogue becomes impossible. And so we return to a terrifying question. If everyone lives in a different information universe, how can we possibly share the same reality? Political bias does not just distort facts. It distorts our ability to see each other as real human beings. Instead of as representatives of a side, we are tasked with opposing. So the problem is not just what do you believe about politics, but also, can you maintain the ability to see others as human beings, even when their beliefs threaten yours? That, if you can do it, is true unbiased thinking, or at least the first step toward it. And if political bias shows how people can distort facts to protect identity, there is another bias that shows we cannot even accurately assess our own competence. The Dunning-Kruger effect, named after psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger. This effect was published in 1999 after a series of experiments that revealed something uncomfortable. The least competent people tend to be the most confident, while truly skilled people often underestimate their own ability. In the original study, Dunning and Kruger had college students take tests on logic, grammar, and humor. Afterward, they asked each person to estimate their own ranking relative to others. Result: the bottom 12%, those with the lowest scores, believed they ranked in the top 60%. In other words, they overestimated their ability by double, not slightly off, dangerously off. Meanwhile, the top performers rated themselves lower than they actually were. Why? Dunning and Kruger provided a crucial explanation to accurately evaluate a skill. You need that skill itself. If you lack competence, you also lack the ability to recognize your own incompetence. The person who doesn't know they are wrong is wrong, but doesn't have enough knowledge to see that they are wrong. This is the key point. Incompetence does not just produce errors. It hides those errors from your own awareness. And this is not confined to the lab. The effect appears everywhere in American society, from small matters to high-stakes decisions. A classic example: surveys show that 93% of Americans believe they are above-average drivers. This is a statistically impossible paradox, yet it is psychological reality. Everyone thinks they're in the top group. This doesn't just apply to driving. In finance, most amateur investors are confident they can beat the market, even though long-term data shows 85–90% fail to do so. In the workplace, underperforming employees often believe they are doing well, while high performers often worry they are not good enough. In online debates, those with the least knowledge tend to assert themselves most confidently. The Dunning-Kruger effect explains all of this with a very simple but hard-to-accept mechanism. Low competence comes with a lack of self-awareness about that competence. You cannot fix errors you cannot see. You cannot improve a skill you think you already master. And you cannot learn more when you believe you already know enough. But why does the brain allow this? Because from an evolutionary perspective, confidence can sometimes matter more than accuracy. Confident individuals are more likely to be chosen as group leaders, attract mates, and make quick decisions in dangerous environments. So the brain evolved to prioritize the feeling of certainty, even when that feeling does not match reality. Importantly, the Dunning-Kruger effect does not mock low-skilled people. It reminds us that everyone, all of us, has areas where we are amateurs, but believe we are knowledgeable. Even Dunning once said something very important. This effect isn't about other people. It's about you. It's just that you don't know in which domain. This was confirmed in a 2018 study showing the Dunning-Kruger effect also appears among experts. Even highly credentialed people misjudge their ability when they step outside their field of expertise. A good doctor does not necessarily understand macroeconomics. An excellent engineer does not necessarily understand public policy. A great teacher does not necessarily assess investment risks accurately. But because they are skilled in one area, they easily assume that skill transfers to others. And so the bias continues to operate. More importantly, the Dunning-Kruger effect helps explain why public debates in society often become extreme. When the least informed are the most confident, they speak the loudest. When the truly knowledgeable are cautious, they speak softly or slowly. Result: the loudest voices in the public square often come from those who most overestimate their own competence. But there is an interesting upside. The Dunning-Kruger effect also shows that intellectual humility is not weakness. It is a sign of accurate self-awareness about one's limits. The more genuinely skilled someone is, the more likely they are to say, "I'm not sure," or "I need to see more data," or "I could be wrong." And that is what science demands, what objective thinking demands, and what bias hates most. So the question is not, who out there has Dunning-Kruger? The real question is, in which areas am I experiencing Dunning-Kruger without realizing it? If you never ask yourself that question, the answer is probably in more areas than you think. And there is an even more frightening phenomenon: groupthink, when an entire group is wrong together, and wrong in a way so convincing that no one dares question it. This phenomenon was described in detail by psychologist Irving Janis in 1972. But the classic example occurred more than a decade earlier, the Bay of Pigs in 1961. There, a group of intelligent, experienced White House advisors unanimously approved a plan to invade Cuba, despite its many obvious flaws. Not because they didn't see the problems, but because they didn't want to disrupt the consensus in the room. Everyone thought, if everyone agrees, I must be wrong. And it was precisely the fear of being the only dissenter that plunged the entire group into collective overconfidence. Janis called this mechanism conformity pressure, the pressure to conform to the group. Dissenting voices were not forbidden. They were simply seen as annoying. And when dissent becomes inconvenient, the group self-eliminates diversity of viewpoint, leading to confident but wrong decisions. 25 years later, another tragic example emerged: the 1986 NASA Challenger space shuttle disaster. Engineers from Morton Thiokol had warned about a serious flaw in the rubber O-ring seals, especially in temperatures below freezing. Prior data clearly showed that O-rings became brittle, contracted, and failed to seal joints in cold weather. And on the morning of the launch, the temperature at the launch pad was only about 01 degrees Celsius to 0 degrees Celsius, the lowest ever for any shuttle launch. The engineers requested a delay, but pressure from management, from the schedule, from public expectations, and from the desire not to cause trouble caused those warnings to be downplayed. An emergency meeting took place in which engineer Roger Borsjoli and colleagues presented risk charts. But instead of asking, what does this data say? Leadership asked, is there conclusive proof that the launch will fail? That was the wrong question at the wrong time. Science does not operate on absolute certainty, but on probability and risk. Yet under collective pressure, the engineers gradually fell silent. Objections were labeled overly cautious, and the launch decision was approved. 73 seconds after liftoff, the Challenger exploded. 7 astronauts died, and part of the cause lay in the very mechanism of groupthink. The dissenter was seen as the problem, not as a source of information. So how does groupthink operate? Simply, humans are a social species. From primitive times, survival meant living in a group, and being excluded from the group meant danger. So the brain evolved the tendency toward conformity bias, the bias to conform to the group. When you stand alone, you may think very clearly, but when you sit in a room full of people agreeing with each other, your brain recognizes one thing: my opinion could cause social danger, and it automatically prioritizes harmony over truth. Research shows that in large groups, the probability that someone with a dissenting view will speak up drops by 50–70%, even when they hold clear evidence. Many believe that the more intellectual a group is, the less groupthink occurs. But the opposite is true. The smarter the group, the stronger the groupthink, because smart people are better at constructing persuasive reasons to agree with each other. They build consensus on a foundation of sharp but collectively mistaken arguments. And here is something many people fail to realize. Groupthink does not only occur in politics or at NASA. It occurs in the workplace when people stay silent in front of a bad idea because they don't want to upset the boss. It occurs in friend groups where everyone thinks others agree, but in reality, everyone is silent because they believe they are the minority. It occurs online when a viewpoint is repeated so often that it becomes normal, and anyone who disagrees is immediately attacked. Groupthink is the bias that turns individual error into collective error. It gives you the feeling that you are thinking with others, but in reality, you are stopping thinking in order to fit in with others. It makes social signals stronger than truth signals, and if you are not careful, you will become one of the people in that 1986 meeting room, looking at the warning data chart and thinking, surely the others know better than I do. So the important question is not, why did they make such a serious mistake? But in the groups I belong to, am I keeping the truth silent because of the pressure to agree? If the answer is yes, then groupthink is not their story. It is happening right now in your own life. The status quo bias, the tendency to prefer keeping everything the same, even when change would be better. This concept was most clearly described in the classic 1988 study by economists William Samuelson and Richard Zeckhauser. They conducted a series of experiments in which participants were asked to choose among options that were identical in benefits but different in starting point. The consistent result, 58% to 70% of participants chose the familiar option, even when the alternative was objectively superior. In other words, people don't choose the best, they choose the most familiar. Part of the reason is that the brain hates risk, and change always carries risk. But there is a deeper cause. In every choice, doing nothing is interpreted by the brain as safe, while doing something is interpreted as dangerous, even when the actual risk levels are identical. Importantly, status quo bias is not confined to the lab. It appears everywhere in American society, from public policy, consumer habits, to the way you use technology every day. In public policy, voters often resist change, even when data shows the change would be beneficial. For example, in a 2014 survey, more than half of respondents opposed switching to a new retirement system, even though the proposed model would increase long-term benefits. What made them oppose it was not that they read the data and found it unreasonable, but the discomfort of touching something that's already working. In consumer products, status quo bias explains why more than 80% of American customers continue using their old internet or phone plan. Even when newer plans are cheaper and faster, they don't want to risk changing contracts, calling customer service, or reading new information. The brain says, just keep it the same. Why change? In technology, status quo bias is so strong, it can delay progress for decades. Remember when Windows switched from the classic interface to the ribbon interface? A massive wave of users protested fiercely, not because the new interface was worse, but because they were used to the old one. The same happened when Facebook changed its layout, when Apple removed the home button on the iPhone, or when Gmail switched to a new design. Each time, people reacted as strongly as if something serious had happened. In reality, we just hate change. Status quo bias is so powerful that it can keep you holding on to harmful habits, continuing to use weak passwords just because you're used to it, continuing unhealthy eating habits because everything's still fine, staying in a draining job just because leaving is too complicated. A 2010 healthcare study showed that more than 40% of patients refused to switch to a more effective new medication simply because they were used to the old one, even when doctors clearly explained the benefits. Reason: the brain prioritizes comfort over accuracy. It chooses the least bothersome over the most correct. But why does the brain do this? From an evolutionary perspective, sticking to the familiar helped your ancestors avoid deadly risks. If a group survived by eating a certain fruit, switching to a new fruit could be dangerous. If they were safe in a valley, leaving could lead to encountering predators. Familiarity equals sign safety. Change equals sign risk. Your brain still runs that formula. The problem is that in the 21st century, risk no longer resembles the Stone Age. Switching internet providers does not threaten survival. Leaving a bad job does not mean predator attack. But your brain, programmed hundreds of thousands of years ago, still reacts the same way. And because status quo bias operates silently, it creates the illusion that the familiar choice is naturally the correct one. It confuses comfortable with accurate, familiar with optimal. But history also shows that status quo bias has contributed to many major failures. Many organizations failed to adapt in time. Kodak didn't switch to digital cameras. Blockbuster didn't switch to streaming. Major companies collapsed because they believed the old way still works. In each case, what killed them was not a mistake, but delay. And that is what also happens in personal life. Sometimes what prevents you from reaching a better version of yourself is not lack of ability, but lack of motivation to change. And if the status quo bias makes you cling to what is familiar, there is another bias that makes you cling so desperately: loss aversion, the fear of loss. This bias is a core part of prospect theory, proposed in 1979 by the two Nobel Prize winning psychologists, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. According to this theory, losing $100 causes pain 2 to 2.5 times greater than the pleasure of gaining $100. In other words, the pain of loss is so intense that it outweighs the joy of an equivalent gain. You feel losses more clearly, more deeply, and more persistently than any gain of the same size. This explains a great deal of irrational human behavior. In investing, for example, investors will hold on to a losing stock, not because they believe it will rise, but because they cannot bear the feeling of realizing the loss. Actually losing the money hurts more than the possibility of making it back somewhere else. As a result, they hold the stock until the damage becomes much larger. They would rather hope wrongly than accept defeat. Loss aversion does not appear only in financial markets. It appears in the abandonment of bad habits, quitting smoking, quitting alcohol, quitting staying up late. All of these are difficult, not because people don't know the benefits, but because the brain interprets the change as a form of loss. Loss of comfort, loss of instant pleasure, loss of a long-standing routine. And since the brain hates loss more than it loves gain, it resists every effort to change. In arguments, loss aversion appears so strongly that you can physically feel it. When someone presents data that proves you wrong, your brain interprets it as a form of loss, loss of credibility, loss of self-image, loss of the feeling that you are right. So instead of accepting the data, you fight to defend your position. Even when you secretly know the other person is correct, you defend the position, not because it is right, but because letting it go would hurt. This leads to a very common psychological mechanism. People overprotect their beliefs. When you believe something, it is not just information, it is psychological property. And losing property always hurts more than acquiring new property. Kahneman once said that humans are not wired to maximize gains. They are wired to minimize losses. From an evolutionary perspective, this once made perfect sense. An ancestor who lost a food source, lost direction, or lost a group member faced far higher risk of death than one who merely gained a new benefit. But in the modern world, loss aversion keeps us stuck in mediocre choices, staying in a hated job, staying in a cooled-off relationship, holding on to outdated views that no longer fit. You may have encountered this in your own life. You keep an unused item just because throwing it away would be a waste. You continue watching a bad movie just because you've already watched 40 minutes. Sunk cost fallacy, a variant of loss aversion. You keep a subscription you don't use because it would be a shame to cancel now. You stay in a failing project because you don't want to admit defeat. Loss aversion makes every small step forward harder than necessary. It causes you to exaggerate the pain of letting go and minimize the benefit of receiving. It makes you believe that changing course will be excruciating, when in reality, most of that pain exists only in anticipation, not in reality. But the most interesting aspect of loss aversion is the way it explains why people defend their opinions more fiercely than they defend truth. When a belief is an investment of time, emotion, identity, letting it go feels like a loss. And because losses hurt more than gains feel good, no matter how strong the evidence, you tend to cling to the old position, argue to the end, or simply avoid contradictory information. This leads to a profound consequence. The path to objective thinking is always painful, because it requires you to give up something, a familiar belief, a comfortable perspective, or a story you once told yourself. And because the brain hates loss more than it loves truth, it will resist every effort to expand awareness. Loss aversion is a powerful bias, not because it makes you afraid of losing money, but because it makes you afraid of losing anything, from arguments, opinions, to tiny pieces of your ego. The question is not, what am I afraid of losing, but what am I holding on to only because I'm afraid to lose it, not because it's actually correct. If you answer honestly, you will see that loss aversion is quietly rewriting many of the choices in your life more than you ever realized. Intelligent people are not less biased. They are often more biased. This may sound counterintuitive, but it is clearly demonstrated in the 2018 work of researchers Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber, who proposed the concept of the cognitive sophistication effect. They found that people with strong reasoning ability, sharp critical thinking, precise logic, rich vocabulary, do not use their intelligence to seek truth, but very often use it to defend pre-existing positions. The smarter the person, the more reasoning tools they have, the greater their ability to rationalize, and paradoxically, the stronger the bias. They don't just get it wrong, they get it wrong intelligently. In many experiments, Mercier and Sperber showed that people with strong argumentation skills produce more persuasive reasons, more citations, and stronger rebuttals, but all of it just to reinforce their initial belief. They do not use intelligence to correct errors. They use it to cover them up. This is not only true in the lab, it is true in the history of science, where some of the most brilliant minds sometimes made huge mistakes precisely because of their confidence in their own ability. A classic example, Lord Kelvin, one of the greatest physicists of the 19th century. Kelvin was a genius. He laid the foundation for thermodynamics, improved transatlantic telegraph technology, and was knighted for his enormous contributions. But in the late 1890s, when meteorologist Alfred Wegener began proposing the idea of continental drift, Kelvin fiercely opposed it. He argued that the Earth had cooled too quickly for continental plates to move, based on his own heat calculations, calculations that later turned out to rest on false assumptions. He did not know about heat from radioactive decay inside the Earth. But because Kelvin was so great, the entire scientific community was pulled along by prestige bias and anchoring bias. Many young scientists looked at him and thought, if Kelvin opposes it, Wegener must be wrong. They criticized, rejected, even mocked the idea, even though the geological evidence at the time was already quite convincing. Kelvin was not wrong because he lacked intelligence. He was wrong because he was too intelligent, too confident in his own model, too brilliant at constructing sharp arguments to refute any contrary evidence. He was blinded by his own intellect. And this is exactly the point. Mercier and Sperber want to emphasize critical thinking did not evolve to find truth. It evolved to win arguments. Your ancestors lived in tribes. Persuading others was more important than objective analysis. Therefore, human argumentative intelligence is not a truth-seeking radar, but a defense system for belief. The smarter you are, the stronger that defense system becomes, and the stronger the bias becomes. This is why very intelligent people are sometimes the hardest to change their minds. They have enough skill to turn any evidence into an argument supporting their pre-existing belief. They have enough vocabulary to rebut any opposing view. They have enough confidence to ignore signs that they might be wrong. They are overly skilled internal lawyers, and like any good lawyer, their job is not to find truth, but to defend their client, which in this case is their own belief. This also explains why debates among very intelligent people often become tense, prolonged, and never-ending. Both sides are too good at defending, too good at bending facts, too good at constructing arguments that sound very logical, but are not truly aimed at truth. And the scariest part is, intelligent people are just as prone to the illusion of explanatory depth, confirmation bias, and motivated reasoning. The only difference is that they make those illusions look far more reasonable. All of this leads to a simple but heavy conclusion. No one is immune to bias. Not scientists, not professors, not high IQ people, not people who read a lot of books, not you, not me. In fact, the smarter you are, the more careful you must be, because intelligence only makes bias more sophisticated, more powerful, and harder to detect. So the real question is not, am I biased? The correct question is, how strong is my bias? And am I using my intelligence to seek truth or to protect illusion? If you do not ask yourself that question, there is a very high chance you are exactly where your brain wants you, confident, eloquent, and completely controlled by bias. And if the fact that intelligent people still fall into bias traps shows that intelligence does not protect us from distortion, there is another bias that is dangerous at a stealth level, to the point you never know you are falling. For it, hindsight bias, the illusion of I knew it all along. This is the phenomenon that makes you believe you correctly predicted an event, even when you never actually predicted it. It distorts memory, rewrites personal history, and causes you to become overconfident in your own forecasting ability. A 1975 study by psychologist Baruch Fishoff showed that 85% of participants misremembered that they had correctly predicted an outcome after learning the event had occurred. In other words, after the fact happened, they believed they knew it would turn out that way, even though in reality they did not. The brain does not merely store memory, it edits memory to make the story of your life seem more logical, more coherent, and to make you look smarter, even to yourself. Hindsight bias appears starkly in every major event in American society. Look back at the dot-com bubble of 2000, when the tech market crashed. Millions of investors lost everything. And suddenly, everyone was saying, I knew it. It was way too overheated. But if you look at the data before 2000, financial reports, market commentary, analyses from that time, you will see very few people actually predicted the collapse. Most investors thought technology will change everything, and many experts believed that growth model couldn't stop. But after the bubble burst, collective memory was rewritten. Minor doubts were exaggerated into, I saw it coming, while mistakes were erased from memory. The same happened with the 2008 housing crisis. After the mortgage market collapsed, after Lehman Brothers failed, after the banking system nearly imploded, the whole country heard the familiar phrases, I knew it, house prices couldn't keep rising forever, or that was so obvious. But if it was really so obvious, why didn't the banks, the investment funds, the credit rating agencies, organizations with thousands of analysts see it? Why did millions of Americans buy homes with adjustable rate mortgages without understanding the risk? Why did leading economists miss the signs? Because no one truly knew in advance. Only after everything happened did the brain rewrite the story to make it look like we had known all along. Hindsight bias makes every past event look obvious. It causes you to underestimate the complexity of the world. It makes you think you understand the causes when you are really just reconstructing the story in the most sensible way for the present. And this is the most dangerous part. Hindsight bias takes away your ability to learn from mistakes because it makes you believe you didn't really make a mistake. You think I should have seen that coming instead of I didn't see that coming, and I need to understand why. It causes you to be excessively confident in your ability to predict the future, even though in reality you are only predicting backward, explaining the past with available data. It causes you to judge others more harshly. They were stupid to do that, without realizing that you yourself, if placed in exactly the same circumstances, with exactly the same information at the time, very likely would have made the same decision. And the brain does this not because you are deliberately lying to yourself, but because it hates messiness. It wants a smooth, easy to understand, consistent story about who you are. So it fills in the gaps with certainty. It edits old doubts into "I thought so" all along. It turns surprises into "that had to happen." It turns you into a main character with good intuition, even when that intuition only appeared after the event ended. Hindsight bias also distorts your view of others. When they fail, you think they should have known better, when in reality, no one truly knew better. This leads to impatience, lack of empathy, and sometimes misjudging people who are trying to do the right thing under ambiguous conditions. But perhaps the greatest harm of hindsight bias lies here. It makes you believe the world is more predictable than it really is, and therefore you prepare far too poorly for the unexpected. If you believe you usually guessed right, you underestimate uncertainty. And when the future does not follow the smooth story your brain wants, you once again edit memory to protect your self-image. It is an endless loop. So the important question is not what did you predict correctly. The important question is, how many things do you think you predicted, but actually you just misremembered? If you are not willing to ask that question, hindsight bias will continue rewriting the history in your head, making you confidently wrong and slow to learn. The most dangerous thing for anyone who wants to think without bias. And if hindsight bias shows how the brain is willing to rewrite memory to protect the story about itself, then this brings us to an unavoidable truth. You can never completely eliminate bias. No one is absolutely objective. No brain is bias-free. But that does not mean you are powerless. It only means that your goal is not to eradicate bias, but to manage it, minimize it, and become aware of it. This is the core of an important 1994 work by psychologists Timothy D. Wilson and Nancy Brekke, who introduced the concept of dubiousing. Instead of trying to fix the brain, create environments, habits, and strategies that force it to operate more accurately. Wilson and Brekke pointed out something painful but very true. People rarely fall into bias because of lack of information. They fall into bias because of lack of mechanisms to control themselves. So the question is not, how do I change my brain, but what systems do I need to create to make my brain work more correctly? And the answer lies in a series of dubiousing tools that have been rigorously studied in cognitive science. Tool number 1, write predictions before seeing the outcome. This is an extremely powerful technique against hindsight bias and confirmation bias. When you record your prediction before the data arrives, you create evidence against your own brain. It cannot rewrite memory because you have locked the memory into written words. Skilled investors, serious scientists, and even clinical doctors use this method. It forces you to see exactly what you thought before the event occurred. Tool number 2, actively seek disconfirming evidence. The thing philosopher Karl Popper considered the core of scientific thinking. Your brain tends to seek information that supports your view. Dubiousing forces you to do the opposite. Ask, what would prove me wrong? Doing so is not natural, not comfortable, but it is extremely effective. Studies show that simply thinking about disconfirming possibilities significantly reduces bias levels. Tool number 3, practice slow thinking, as described by Daniel Kahneman in his book Thinking, Fast and Slow, 2011. System 1 of the brain is fast, intuitive, energy-saving, but full of bias. System 2 is slow, energy-consuming, but more accurate. You cannot live using only slow thinking. You would burn out, but you can choose to activate it in high-stakes situations, financial decisions, evaluating people, analyzing data, taking responsibility, or any situation where bias could lead to serious consequences. Just a 3-second pause, just one question, am I reacting or am I thinking, is enough to shift from system 1 to system 2. Tool number 4, Dialogue with people who hold opposing views, not to defeat them, not to convince them, but to see the world through a different frame of reference. Research shows that exposure to opposing viewpoints increases the ability to consider multiple angles and reduces overconfidence in a single story. But one thing is crucial: the dialogue only works when you truly listen, not when you are just waiting for your turn to rebut. Tool number 5, self-check your emotional motives. This is a form of cognitive self-audit in which you ask, do I believe this because of the data or because of emotion? Am I seeking truth or am I seeking the feeling of being right? Does this conclusion make me comfortable or make me accurate? Kahneman once said, no tool is stronger than recognizing when emotion is leading you to a quick conclusion. When emotion gets involved, bias doubles. Tool number 6, pre-registration in scientific research, meaning writing down hypotheses, methods, and data analysis plans before the experiment begins. This is an extremely powerful measure against publication bias and p-hacking. When you lock the process from the start, you cannot cherry-pick data to fit your desires, and you cannot let bias steer you during analysis. Pre-registration is becoming the gold standard in many mainstream scientific fields, but you don't need to be a scientist to use the principle. Write down evaluation criteria before starting a project, a relationship, a plan that is pre-registration in everyday life. It forces you to be more honest with yourself. Tool number 7, and perhaps the most important, learn to live with uncertainty. One of the biggest sources of bias is the desire for everything to be clear, to have an answer, to have absolute certainty. I have approximate answers, beliefs that may be wrong, and different levels of uncertainty, and I find that far more interesting than having certain answers that may be wrong. Objectivity is not a state, it is a discipline, a process, a habit practiced over a lifetime. The biasing is not fixing the brain, it is training the brain. You cannot completely eliminate bias, but you can learn to see it when it appears, and that already completely changes the game. When you start seeing bias, you are no longer controlled by it unconsciously. You become the one holding the reins. And when you hold the reins, you can do what most people never do: think deliberately. Realizing that you have bias does not make you weaker. It makes you stronger. It does not make you confused. It makes you humble. It does not make you doubt everything. It makes you cautious with your own thinking. So the final lesson of this section is the goal is not to become a person without bias, but to become a person who knows they have bias and acts accordingly. Nature does not demand that you be perfect. It only demands that you be honest. The hardest part being honest with yourself. Objectivity is not the default setting of the human brain. It is an ideal that we must continually strive toward. The 20 bias mechanisms I have described to you, from anchoring confirmation bias, availability heuristic, illusion of explanatory depth, groupthink, status quo bias, loss aversion, all the way to hindsight bias and identity protective cognition, all point to one thing: no one thinks in pure rationality. Not you, not me, not scientists, professors, experts, or the smartest people you know. Our brains evolved not to seek truth, but to survive, to react quickly, to navigate social life, to protect identity, to feel right. And precisely because it performs so excellently at those tasks, it becomes a distorted mirror when we try to look at the nature of the world. But this is not bad news. This is the starting point of wisdom. The journey to truth does not begin with gathering facts or learning more theories. It begins with recognizing your own limits, recognizing that you view the world through a lens, not directly with the naked eye. Only when you understand how distorted that lens is can you adjust it to see more clearly. That is why I always repeat the sentence that many consider the most important in my entire career. You must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. That statement is not a warning. It is a guiding principle. It reminds you that the greatest enemy of clear thinking is not out there, not people who disagree with you, not misinformation, not social media, but inside your own brain. You are not fooled by others nearly as much as you are fooled by yourself. And from that realization, a broader philosophy emerges. You cannot eliminate bias, but you can learn to recognize when it is steering you. You can pause for a moment before reacting. You can ask, am I thinking or am I justifying? You can seek disconfirming evidence instead of only seeking supporting evidence. You can listen to others, not to reply, but to see the world from an angle your brain could not create on its own. You can write predictions before seeing results, to prevent memory from rewriting history. You can choose to slow down when every instinct pushes you to go fast. You can create systems to counter the innate weaknesses of the brain. None of these things turn you into a person without bias, but they turn you into a person capable of seeing their own bias. And that is the difference between someone who thinks and someone who merely reacts. The truth is, humans were not designed to be objective, but humans can aspire to objectivity. They can pursue it. They can get closer to it day by day through discipline and humility. And with every small step you take, every bias you recognize, every time you choose honesty with yourself over comfort, you become a little freer from the invisible chains of the brain. So I want to end with an open question, a question only you can answer, and the answer may change the way you see the world starting tomorrow. If you know that every thought carries bias, how will you see the world differently from tomorrow onward? Let that question stay with you, not to make you anxious, but to remind you that objective thinking is not a destination. It is a path, and you have just traveled a very long segment of that path. If you want to continue joining me on other journeys of exploring thinking and the universe, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any future parts. See you again in the next lecture, where we once again ask questions, doubt, and see the world a little more clearly.